What if I told you that some ancient punishments were so extreme that even the men who ordered them hesitated when they finally saw them carried out? And what if one of the most feared empires in human history, the Assyrian Empire, built its power not only through strategy and conquest, but through acts of such calculated brutality that they challenged the limits of what a state could do to maintain control? When we look at the chronicles of the ancient Near East, there is a moment that forces us to ask a disturbing question. How far can an empire go when it believes fear is the strongest weapon it possesses? Imagine a world where rebellion was not simply crushed, but erased. A world where entire cities were marked as examples, where the punishment for resisting imperial rule was engineered to terrorize every neighboring kingdom. The Assyrians did not merely defeat their enemies, they dismantled their identities, their pride, and their hope. And behind every recorded conquest, there were eyewitnesses, scribes, soldiers, and generals who stood at the edge of what they believed was necessary, and what they secretly feared had gone too far. This tension is the doorway into the darkest side of ancient power, where political dominance became inseparable from psychological warfare. The Assyrian kings understood something chilling. Terror travels faster than armies. By transforming rebel cities into symbols of absolute submission, they shaped the geopolitical landscape of the ancient world. But while the royal inscriptions glorify these acts as triumphs, some accounts hint at reactions that contradict the official narrative. Moments when commanders looked upon the aftermath of their own campaigns and felt something unexpected, something unsettling. It is within these fragments of hesitation that we begin to uncover the magnitude of what truly happened in the corners of history that textbooks rarely dare to explore. And as we open this chapter of ancient cruelty, it becomes impossible not to wonder how these deliberate acts of extreme violence reshaped entire civilizations. You might even ask yourself whether humanity has really changed, or whether these cycles of brutality still echo through modern states, governments, and conflicts. What you are about to discover may surprise you, because the brutality of the Assyrians was not simply warfare. It was a system, a method, a message carved into the very stones of conquered cities. Before we move forward, tell me something. Have you ever stopped to think about how fear can become a tool of political control? If this opening is already triggering questions in your mind, share your thoughts in the comments. Your opinion helps enrich this conversation, so leave a comment, drop a like, and make sure you are subscribed to the channel. What comes next will connect directly to everything we began exploring here, and the implications run deeper than most people imagine. So let us continue unfolding this story step by step. The structure of Assyrian domination was not improvised or chaotic. It was a machine designed over centuries, refined through countless conflicts, and fueled by an ideology that placed the king at the center of a divine mandate. To understand why the treatment of rebel cities was so extreme, we need to step inside this machinery and see how the empire crafted a political system in which violence was not merely permissible, but essential for order. The Assyrians believed the world was inherently hostile, and that only uncompromising strength preserved stability. Every province, every governor, every soldier operated within this unspoken truth. At the top of this hierarchy stood the king, portrayed as the earthly executor of the god's will. This narrative was not just religious rhetoric, it was a strategic tool that justified the harshest decisions. When a city rebelled, it was not simply defying a ruler. It was, in Assyrian ideology, defying cosmic order itself. This framing allowed the state to turn punishment into performance. The response needed to be overwhelming, visible, and carefully documented, so that no future rebel could misunderstand the consequences. In many ways, the empire was shaped by the belief that mercy created instability, while terror preserved peace. This system expanded through an intricate network of governors and provincial administrators who enforced tax collection, labor conscription, and military recruitment. Each region was monitored, evaluated, and expected to deliver absolute compliance. Reports flowed constantly back to the capital, revealing even minor signs of discontent. The Assyrians did not react randomly. They acted with precision. When they detected defiance, they struck swiftly, ensuring that rebellion never had time to spread. The empire did not simply want obedience, it wanted predictability. A rebel city disrupted that predictability and therefore had to be reshaped or removed from the map entirely. What made this system frighteningly efficient was its fusion of bureaucracy and fear. There were records, lists, inventories, and official inscriptions boasting of victories. But behind the polished language lay an institutional acceptance of brutality as a political necessity. The idea that breaking the spirit of one city could stabilize an entire region became the core principle guiding imperial strategy. Chroniclers carved these achievements into stone, but they never fully captured the tremor beneath the surface, the unspoken understanding among officials that they were part of a machine larger and more relentless than themselves. Yet even within this rigid hierarchy, tensions simmered. Not all generals believed the extremes were necessary. Not all governors agreed with the scale of destruction. There were quiet disagreements, subtle hesitations, and private doubts whispered in corridors far from the battlefield. These cracks did not appear in official accounts, but they existed, hinting that the machinery of domination was never as unanimous or unshakable as the inscriptions claimed. And it is within this tension between ideology and human reaction that the next part of this story begins to unfold, pushing us deeper into the strategies used to identify, isolate, and punish the cities that dared to resist Assyrian power. Before a single soldier marched, the Assyrians had already mapped the emotional and political pulse of every region under their rule. The empire relied on a sophisticated intelligence network composed of merchants, local informants, regional officials, and military scouts. These individuals reported subtle changes in behavior, unusual gatherings, shortages of tribute, or shifts in alliances. A rebellious city rarely erupted overnight. It simmered first, and the Assyrians were trained to detect that simmering long before open defiance surfaced. Their system operated like a pressure gauge, constantly measuring loyalty and anticipating the moment when pressure might become dangerous. Once suspicion emerged, the city was quietly reclassified in archival reports. It moved from compliant to unstable, and then from unstable to potentially rebellious. This shift triggered a chain of decisions behind the walls of the royal palace. Generals received coded communications instructing them to redirect troops, secure strategic roads, and prepare logistics. Governors were ordered to increase surveillance, request additional supplies, and monitor the movement of influential families. It was a calculated escalation intended to surround a problem before it became a threat. The Assyrians believed rebellion was a disease, and like a disease, it needed to be isolated before it spread. As soon as signs of resistance became undeniable, the empire initiated the first stage of confrontation, containment. Armies approached not with chaos, but with methodical precision. They sealed trade routes, cut water access, intercepted messengers, and blocked escape paths. Their goal was not simply to attack, it was to suffocate the city economically and psychologically. Citizens began to feel the weight of the empire long before the first siege engine touched their gates. Hunger, fear, and isolation worked as early weapons, softening the population and weakening the resolve of local leaders. When the army finally encircled the city, the Assyrians evaluated it through a strategic lens. Not all rebel cities were treated equally. Some were marked as essential for regional stability, others for symbolic value, and others because their defiance challenged the prestige of the king. A city that resisted taxation might face harsh penalties, but a city that killed an Assyrian ambassador or sheltered fugitives earned a level of retaliation designed to echo across an entire continent. The classification determined everything: the length of the siege, the intensity of the attack, and the scale of the punishment that would follow. Inside the walls, inhabitants watched the empire assemble a theater of war. Siege towers rolled forward, battering rams advanced under protective shields, archers formed lines that darkened the air with arrows, and specialized engineers prepared trenches and ramps. Each step signaled that the city was no longer seen as a community, but as an example waiting to be carved into the memory of future generations. The Assyrians did not merely intend to win, they intended to control the narrative of that victory. And as the machinery of siege unfolded, a deeper question began to haunt even seasoned commanders. Once the gates fell, what would be deemed necessary to restore imperial order? This looming uncertainty set the stage for what came next, where punishment became spectacle and domination transformed into something far more disturbing. When the walls finally collapsed and the Assyrian soldiers poured into the defeated city, what followed was not a chaotic outburst of rage, but a carefully orchestrated display of punishment. The Assyrian leadership believed that brutality had to be visible, memorable, and expansive enough to outlive the immediate moment. Their goal was not simply to destroy a rebellion, it was to engrave the consequences into the consciousness of every city that might be tempted to resist in the future. And so, the aftermath of conquest became a stage where fear was crafted with deliberate precision. The first phase was always separation. Captured leaders, nobles, and military commanders were singled out, not only for interrogation, but for public treatment intended to break the psychological spine of the population. The Assyrians understood that authority rested not only in structures, but in symbolism. By targeting the figures who embodied local pride, they dismantled the emotional foundation upon which rebellions stood. These individuals were paraded, displayed, and punished not in hidden chambers, but in open squares, transforming the city itself into an audience. What makes these scenes particularly haunting is the level of detail recorded in royal inscriptions. They describe punishments in a tone that blends pride with cold precision. Impalements arranged in long rows, flayings performed as warnings, decapitated heads mounted on city gates, and fields filled with the remnants of shattered communities. For the Assyrians, such acts were not expressions of uncontrolled cruelty. They were messages crafted to echo across the empire. Every punishment was a sentence carved into history, telling future rebels exactly what awaited them. But beneath the official narrative, there were moments of dissonance. Some generals, hardened by decades of warfare, witnessed these punishments and felt a quiet disturbance. The brutality was not always easy to watch, even for the men who had ordered it. Accounts found in less formal writings and scattered letters hint at unease, discomfort, and at times even regret. Soldiers who had marched with confidence sometimes averted their eyes when the punishments began. Commanders who had demanded strict obedience sometimes paused before approving the final acts of retribution. These cracks in the human armor remind us that the empire's system of terror, though immense, was carried out by individuals who occasionally felt the weight of what they were doing. Yet the machinery of domination did not allow hesitation to influence policy. Once a city was marked as rebellious, its fate was sealed. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed to erase cultural identity. Temples were defiled or repurposed to symbolize the supremacy of the Assyrian gods. Populations were divided, with artisans and skilled laborers taken into captivity, while others faced punishments meant to tear apart any remaining resistance. This was not impulsive violence. It was calculated restructuring, designed to ensure that the city would never again rise in defiance. And as the smoke from the ruins rose into the sky, the Empire chroniclers prepared the final narrative, ensuring the story of the city's suffering would travel far beyond its borders. Through these accounts, the punishment became larger than the moment. It became a warning carved into the memory of the ancient world. Before we continue, tell me something. When you imagine these scenes of state-crafted brutality, what thoughts or reactions come to your mind? Leave a comment sharing how this strikes you. Your perspective helps shape the understanding of this history as we move forward. Once the initial wave of punishment had been delivered and the city's resistance crushed, the Assyrian strategy shifted from destruction to transformation. The empire's long-term stability depended on more than fear. It required control over populations, resources, and identities. This is where the machinery of forced deportations came into play, a mechanism as influential as any military victory. The Assyrians mastered the art of removing entire communities from their native lands and scattering them across distant provinces. The objective was clear: eliminate the cultural roots that allowed rebellion to grow. These mass relocations were not spontaneous. They were calculated operations involving administrators, military escorts, and logistical planners who coordinated the movement of thousands of people. Families were separated, skilled workers were singled out for strategic use, and religious leaders were often isolated to weaken the cultural fabric. Entire caravans of displaced populations were marched for weeks or months, crossing deserts, rivers, and foreign territories under constant supervision. The exhaustion, fear, and disorientation served the empire's interests. A displaced population was a manageable population, especially when scattered across multiple regions where language, customs, and political alliances were unfamiliar. The Assyrians recognized that people tied to their homeland held a sense of pride and independence. To break this bond, they removed communities from their own soil and transplanted them into environments where survival required adaptation. In these new lands, deportees encountered different climates, different laws, and different gods. Everything familiar was replaced by an empire-controlled system that forced them to rebuild their lives under new authority. This process was not merely displacement, it was engineered assimilation. The more fragmented the original identity became, the less likely rebellion was to emerge again. Behind the scenes, royal archives meticulously recorded these relocations. Lists of names, professions, inventory of possessions, and numbers of livestock accompanied each wave of deportation. These documents reveal that the Assyrians did not treat deportees as nameless masses, but as resources to be redistributed. Skilled artisans, metalworkers, scribes, and builders were often assigned to royal projects. Farmers were settled in regions lacking labor. Warriors were integrated into auxiliary forces or placed under strict surveillance. This redistribution served a dual purpose: strengthening the empire while weakening the conquered cities beyond recognition. Over time, these movements reshaped the demographic landscape of the ancient Near East. Entire regions became mosaics of different cultures, forcibly blended together. Traditions faded, languages mixed, and former identities dissolved. Into the broader Assyrian administrative system, the empire understood that political resistance required collective memory, and so it targeted the memory itself. By controlling where people lived, how they worked, and whom they lived alongside, the Assyrians performed a form of cultural surgery, cutting away the parts of society that could regenerate rebellion. Yet despite the empire's strategic precision, there were hidden consequences. Deportees carried stories with them, spreading whispers of brutality and resilience across new lands. These whispers traveled farther than armies, shaping how neighboring kingdoms viewed Assyrian power. As populations moved, so did fear. But so did fragments of defiance, waiting for the right moment to surface again. The Assyrians understood that conquering land was only part of maintaining an empire. True domination required controlling minds as well as borders, hearts as well as fortresses. Fear was not incidental. It was central. They developed a sophisticated understanding of psychology long before the term existed, crafting campaigns of terror designed to leave a permanent imprint on both the conquered and the conquerors. Every act of cruelty, every public execution, every display of devastation served as a signal. Disobedience would be met with consequences so extreme that memory alone would prevent repetition. Commanders meticulously orchestrated scenes to maximize their psychological impact. Entire populations were forced to witness punishments that blurred the line between justice and spectacle. Impalements, flayings, and mass executions were positioned so that their reach extended far beyond the immediate victims. Streets, walls, and city gates became instruments of intimidation. In this way, terror itself became a form of diplomacy, a message delivered without negotiation, without intermediaries, without chance for misinterpretation. A city that saw the fate of its neighbor understood the stakes in ways words alone could never convey. The Assyrians also deployed this fear strategically in diplomacy. Ambassadors who resisted imperial demands might return to their home city as living proof of what defiance meant. Reports of massacres, deportations, and humiliation traveled faster than armies. Entire regions recalculated their allegiances based on these signals, choosing submission over rebellion not out of loyalty but self-preservation. Fear became the currency of the empire, traded silently across borders, shaping decisions far from battlefields. Every rumor, every eyewitness account, every whispered story reinforced the empire's omnipresent authority. Even within the military, the psychology of fear played a critical role. Soldiers were trained not only to execute orders, but to internalize the idea that hesitation could be deadly. Generals who doubted the necessity of extreme measures often found themselves sidelined or assigned to less prestigious commands. Through constant repetition, the narrative of absolute control was embedded not just in civilians, but within the ranks of the empire itself. Loyalty and fear were intertwined, producing a disciplined and predictable apparatus of terror that functioned automatically once activated. At the same time, Assyrian officials recognized the subtle limits of fear. Excessive cruelty could provoke rebellion, incite panic, or even fracture loyalty. It had to be precise, measured, and adaptable. They learned that the psychological impact of seeing one city utterly destroyed could resonate more strongly than the indiscriminate slaughter of many. The terror needed to feel deliberate, personal, and inescapable. This understanding allowed them to calibrate punishment, projecting power without completely exhausting their resources or destabilizing the regions they controlled. The genius and horror of the Assyrians lay in their ability to turn fear into a diplomatic tool. A conquered city was a warning for the next. A suffering population was a demonstration to allies. An executed rebel leader was a lesson for the empire itself. By embedding terror into the social and political fabric, they ensured that obedience became internalized. Resistance was not only punished, it was psychologically unthinkable, and as the empire's shadow stretched across Mesopotamia, that shadow carried both the weight of authority and the imprint of calculated cruelty, setting the stage for the next wave of devastation to unfold. The voices that survived the ruins of rebel cities are not always the kings or generals, but the scribes, soldiers, and minor officials who were forced to witness the empire's methods firsthand. Their accounts, often overlooked or buried in archives, provide an unfiltered glimpse into the machinery of terror. Unlike royal inscriptions, which glorify conquest, these testimonies convey a mixture of awe, horror, and reluctant admiration. The streets that once bustled with life became theaters of discipline, where punishment, pain, and psychological pressure unfolded like a carefully rehearsed play. Scribes recorded every detail, the precise placement of impaled leaders along city walls, the order in which households were deported, the sequence of executions in public squares. Soldiers often included notes on the reactions of civilians, the way mothers clutched children to their chests, how artisans and merchants froze in fear, and how local elites knelt in submission or silently cursed the empire. These observations reveal a complex understanding that the Assyrians had developed over generations. Terror was most effective when visible, calculated, and relentless. It needed witnesses. Without witnesses, fear lost its potency. Yet, many soldiers admitted in private correspondence that they were unsettled by what they saw. Some accounts hint at whispered debates among commanders. Was the punishment excessive, or was it precisely calibrated to achieve obedience? The psychological burden on those who carried out these orders was considerable. For decades, Assyrian armies had been trained to merge brutality with discipline, but even the most hardened veteran could recognize moments that exceeded necessity. Their testimony shows that fear was not only imposed on the conquered, it seeped into the very men who executed it, creating a pervasive cycle of tension, doubt, and grim understanding. Moreover, the scribes captured the subtle details of human suffering that formal inscriptions omitted. The quiet despair of families forced from their homes, the trembling hands of leaders compelled to witness the execution of their peers, the silent endurance of citizens who hid in cellars while soldiers destroyed everything above. These microhistories demonstrate that Assyrian power was both external and internal, shaping not only the defeated city but also those who were instruments of its punishment. Each act of cruelty was observed, memorized, and recorded, ensuring that the empire's methods would be known to future generations, even if their official propaganda portrayed only victory. These testimonies also reveal the unintended consequences of such displays. Fear, while effective, could provoke subtle acts of resistance, secret messages passed between captives, or quiet defiance hidden from the eyes of soldiers. The empire's meticulous cruelty created not only obedience, but also stories of human endurance and whispered revolt that survived in corners, vaults, and private notes long after the battlefields were cleared. It is in these fragile, fragmented accounts that we begin to understand the full impact of Assyrian punishment. Domination was not just physical, but deeply psychological, shaping memories and shaping the imagination of those who lived under it. Now, as we consider the weight of what these witnesses observed, think for a moment. What would you have done if placed in their position? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Describe your reaction, your fear, or your interpretation of these events. Your reflections are part of preserving this story, giving voice to those who witnessed history's darkest moments. As the Assyrian Empire extended its reach across Mesopotamia and beyond, its approach to violence and punishment evolved into a finely tuned instrument of statecraft. Expansion was never a matter of brute force alone. It was a calculated blend of intimidation, logistics, and psychological control. Each conquered city added to the empire's resources, but it also introduced new challenges. How do you maintain order over populations that speak different languages, worship different gods, and possess diverse social structures? The answer lay in the careful calibration of institutionalized violence. The empire's administrators quickly realized that excessive cruelty could backfire. Cities entirely destroyed or populations utterly decimated often produced nothing but resentment and instability. In neighboring regions, the Assyrians, pragmatic as they were ruthless, developed a hierarchy of punishment. Minor rebellions might be quelled with deportation and humiliation, while major uprisings received a full demonstration of the empire's lethal capacity. Even in the midst of terror, the Assyrians were aware of balance. Too little punishment invited defiance. Too much could destabilize the fragile control of distant provinces. As the empire's borders expanded, the logistical complexity of maintaining these strategies increased. Governors and generals had to coordinate sieges, deportations, and resource allocation across vast distances. Roads, rivers, and caravan routes became lifelines not only for armies, but for the machinery of control. Cities were connected by a network that allowed rapid response to rebellion. Swift movement of troops, along with the knowledge that any defiance could be met instantly with extreme consequences, reinforced the perception of an omnipresent state. Fear was as much a strategic tool as any army or weapon. Despite the empire's sophistication, there were inherent limits to institutionalized violence. Continuous campaigns of terror required manpower, resources, and coordination. Soldiers and officials could tire, local populations could resist covertly, and logistical failures sometimes undermined carefully laid plans. In some regions, prolonged exposure to harsh punishment created a fragile obedience that could unravel if not constantly reinforced. Assyrian records hint at moments where generals debated the sustainability of punishment, recognizing that cruelty, when overused, risked weakening the very authority it was meant to cement. The expansionist policies also brought the empire into contact with diverse cultures and new forms of resistance. Some cities adopted defensive fortifications or strategic evacuations, while others used diplomacy to avoid the worst punishments. The Assyrians' reputation for cruelty alone often prevented open rebellion. Yet rumors of escapes, uprisings, and defections reached the imperial court, reminding rulers that terror was a powerful but imperfect tool. The empire relied not only on physical control, but also on perception, carefully cultivating an image of unstoppable power to compensate for the limits of its reach. By blending military precision with psychological manipulation, the Assyrians created an empire that seemed limitless, yet beneath the surface, tension and instability persisted. The shadow of fear stretched across conquered lands, but it always carried the seeds of human resilience and defiance. These limits, logistical, psychological, and social, would shape both the empire's strategies and the stories that survived, setting the stage for reactions from neighboring states and the wider ancient world, which observed, adapted, and sometimes resisted in their own ways. Beyond the borders of the Assyrian Empire, neighboring states and distant kingdoms observed the unfolding brutality with a mixture of fear, fascination, and strategic calculation. Messengers carried accounts of the empire's campaigns, bringing news of impaled leaders, razed cities, and deported populations to distant courts. These reports traveled faster than armies, shaping alliances, discouraging rebellion, and even influencing the political calculations of empires that had never directly faced Assyrian soldiers. Fear was now a currency exchanged across regions, more powerful than gold, more persuasive than diplomacy alone. Kings and governors of other territories quickly understood that defiance of Assyrian authority came with extreme consequences. For some, the tales were warnings, compliance could spare their cities, submission might preserve life and property. For others, the horror sparked covert strategies. Some rulers increased fortifications, stockpiled resources, or negotiated tributary arrangements to avoid becoming examples of imperial vengeance. The psychological impact extended far beyond conquered provinces. The empire's reputation preceded its armies, and in many cases, rebellion was stifled before it even began. At the same time, the narratives of Assyrian terror often exaggerated or mythologized events, creating a legend that both intimidated and inspired. Chroniclers and merchants relayed stories of entire populations wiped out, of walls lined with the bodies of those who resisted, and of cities erased from the map as cautionary tales. These narratives served dual purposes. They amplified the empire's power in the perception of outsiders, and they allowed distant rulers to gauge how much compliance might be necessary to avoid similar fates. In some cases, rumors alone were sufficient to maintain submission, yet international observers were not entirely passive. Some regions sought to exploit Assyrian fear as a political tool. Diplomatic envoys attempted to negotiate favorable terms, offering tribute, hostages, or strategic alliances in exchange for mercy or leniency. Others, emboldened by distance or by perceived weaknesses in the empire, tested its limits through minor acts of defiance, observing the consequences before committing to larger-scale resistance. The tension between the empire's reputation and the realities of human resilience created a complex web of deterrence, intimidation, and opportunism across the Near East. Even within the courts of allies and adversaries, the psychological reach of the Assyrians shaped military strategy and governance. Generals trained their armies to anticipate the possibility of psychological warfare, while kings reformed legal codes and punitive measures to demonstrate strength without overextending themselves. Fear was now embedded in the consciousness of entire regions, informing decisions about fortifications, trade routes, and alliances. The Assyrian legacy of terror had become a blueprint for political control, influencing how other states wielded authority long after the events themselves. Through these international reactions, it becomes clear that the Assyrian Empire's influence extended far beyond its physical conquests. Its reputation for cruelty shaped the behavior of entire nations, demonstrating that the true power of terror lies not in destruction alone, but in its ability to control perception. And as these neighboring societies observed, calculated, and adapted, the stage was set for the final consequences of imperial dominance to ripple through the ancient world, leaving traces that would echo through generations of historians, scribes, and storytellers. Even the most fearsome empires eventually faced the erosion of their power, and the Assyrians were no exception. Centuries of dominance, cruelty, and systematic terror left an indelible mark on history, yet the empire could not survive the pressures it had unleashed. Internal instability, overextended borders, and the cumulative strain of maintaining constant fear weakened the foundations of imperial authority. Rebellions erupted in distant provinces, opportunistic neighbors struck at vulnerable territories, and the once meticulously controlled network of cities began to fray. The same mechanisms that had ensured obedience now revealed the limits of terror as a tool of governance. As the empire weakened, the psychological legacy persisted far longer than the physical infrastructure. Stories of massacres, impalements, and deportations continued to circulate, shaping cultural memory across generations. Cities that had been destroyed were rebuilt elsewhere. Populations scattered by force migrated and assimilated, carrying with them the memory of Assyrian cruelty. Chroniclers and scribes preserved these tales, sometimes exaggerating, sometimes interpreting, but always ensuring that the shadow of Assyrian methods lingered in the consciousness of subsequent civilizations. Fear had been a weapon, and even in defeat, its echo remained powerful. Historians today study these events not simply to recount atrocities, but to understand the mechanisms of control, the intersection of psychological warfare with military strategy, and the long-term effects of state-sponsored terror. The lessons are chilling. An empire that perfects fear and systematizes cruelty leaves behind consequences that transcend borders and generations. It is a reminder that power, when wielded without restraint, imprints itself on both the conquered and the conqueror, shaping societies in ways that endure long after the last king falls. And as we reflect on the Assyrian Empire, its conquests, and the terror it deployed, it is impossible not to recognize the dual legacy of history, the visible destruction of cities and the invisible shaping of human memory. The horrors recorded, whispered, and inscribed in clay tablets were tools of both control and caution, leaving echoes that historians and storytellers still follow. Today, the empire itself may have vanished, but its impact on the collective consciousness of the ancient world remains undeniable. If you followed this journey through rebellion, conquest, and calculated terror, take a moment to leave a comment sharing which story struck you the most. Let us know your thoughts on the resilience of the people who endured these campaigns, and reflect on the lessons that even empires cannot erase. Don't forget to like this video if you found it insightful, and make sure you are subscribed so you won't miss future explorations of history's darkest chapters. There's another video waiting that expands on the tactics and psychological strategies used by empires like the Assyrians. Click over and continue the journey with us. History is not just about the past, it's about the echoes that still shape our understanding today.